So let's talk about the basics a little bit. First of all, the MG is an 8-minute speech given by the second affirmative speaker. It's a horizontal speech if it helps you conceptualize the speeches a little bit. So what does that mean? It means you're adding a lot of breadth to the debate. Not only are you covering all of the arguments that have been presented in the debate, but it's often strategic to add to that. So for example, reading maybe a new disadd to a counterplan or presenting a new procedural or piece of theory into the debate. You should also be adding depth in some areas as well, but primarily the MG is a horizontal speech, whereas the MO kind of narrows things down and is more of a vertical speech that goes like this. So MG is broad. As the member of government, your job is to rebuild your case. Case is very important. We'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. And also answer the arguments from the leader of opposition, known as off-case positions. If you do these two things well enough, you can pretty much secure a victory at times in the MG. You can overwhelm the MO with a wide variety of quality arguments that basically makes their job impossible to win the debate at that point. And when I say overwhelm your opponents, you should probably understand you don't have to be fast to be an MG. A lot of times you think of the MG as always, the quickest person, the LOMG, they're really fast, but that's not always the case. So if you're worried about the MG because you're not necessarily the fastest debater, don't worry about that. There's tons of debaters that have been successful just by making very strategic arguments, even if they're slower. But speed can't help with that type of thing. On the other side of that coin, the MG can usually secure a loss if they make such a grievous mistake that the MO can capitalize on that and pretty much leave you in a bad position. I think we've all experienced or probably heard of, you drop your case, you don't get to it, it's just like, oh no, or if you concede an off-case position, a disadd that the other team has read, you're not exactly in the greatest position. So the MG is very important. Even though it's tucked in the middle of the speech, you can make a very big impact with that speech. So now, yes, look at those graphics. Let's talk about rebuilding the case. So one of the biggest and most common mistakes an MG can make is letting the 1AC go to waste. Think about it. Your partner just read 7 minutes of arguments for you to utilize to weigh against what the LO has read, as well as use those to answer off-case positions. So the MG should always talk about the case, and this might take a variety of forms. So first, you might be answering LOC case arguments. If the other team has put answers on your case, you gotta answer those suckers. You just gotta deal with those. Otherwise, you won't have as much sway against your opponent's impacts, and you won't be able to have as much ammo to use to debunk your opponent's arguments. As a general rule, if your opponents cover your case and make arguments on that, you shouldn't put it last in your order. You risk losing your case if you don't have time to get to it, or if your time allocation just gets a little screwed up. And that way, a lot of the arguments you've probably made in answer to the disadvantages, like your link turns and uniqueness that's perhaps predicated on your case, if you don't get to your case and all of a sudden they have answers to those, then all that offense that was predicated on your case you don't have access to anymore, and that puts you in a bad position with them.
Does anyone know if there was a phone charger in this room? Guess not.
Does not appear so.
I don't see it.
I lost a lot of stuff.
That's all good. I checked with Steve in 125.
125, thanks.
He might have-
Sorry for interrupting.
No big. Okay. So now let's talk about making extensions. Now that we know we've got to deal with the case. So making extensions on your case is really important. If the other team has made crucial concessions, you want to capitalize by making extensions, whether that be your uniqueness, your links, your impacts, whatever it is. You want to take advantage of that. So an extension looks like, extend my uniqueness number 3 is the New York Times analysis that said unemployment is decreasing the status quo, right? It's pretty easy. And you'll see the judge, take their pen and literally extend the argument for you. Making an extension is just saying we want this argument to continue to be in the debate. So there's ways to make extensions that are a little better than some other ways. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts of making extensions. So for the do's, you do want to identify the argument you're extending by the sentence and, by the argument section and the substructure. This will help your judge locate the arguments. So PMCs take note that numbering your arguments can make it a lot easier for judges to very quickly identify where the arguments are on the page. So your MG can efficiently make those extensions, and the judge is on the same page as y'all. You should also be identifying the argument's tag or claim. This is in case the judge missed the substructure, which can sometimes happen, particularly in faster rounds. And it should also be highlighting what the argument is, after all, because you're extending that argument for a reason. So you want to be extending the argument, not just the substructure. You should also be watching your judge. You want to make sure that the judge is actually extending the argument, and you can see them often looking for the argument and extending it for you. So always be making eye contact. You know, a lot of times a judge will look up at you if they can't find it. So be in communication with your judge in terms of making eye contact that way. Another thing you want to make sure to do is explain the significance of your extension, and this is kind of what separates mid-level debaters from really good debaters, is not only do you want to extend that argument, but you want to explain what that means, what that does for you in the debate, and how the judge should be using that argument to make a decision. Just saying extend the argument doesn't tell the judge what you want them to actually do with it. So be explaining the significance of how it helps you win the debate. So for example, if you're extending your impact, how does that perhaps outweigh your opponent's argument, or what significance does that have? Or when you extend your link, does that prove maybe the counterclaim doesn't capture that link, so all of a sudden you have a utilization of that argument that the judge can use in their calculus at the end of the debate. You also want to make extensions to answer your opponent's arguments. So make sure you follow up your extension by weighing the warrants as well as the evidence. So for example, if you have an argument that says the economy is bad in the status quo, right, and only the plan can solve it, your opponents might have an argument, a disad, that says actually the economy's okay, but you're the one that collapses that, right? Two opposing claims. So after you make the extension, you want to say why your analysis and why your evidence or warrants is superior to your opponent's. Otherwise, the judge all of a sudden has these two competing claims and doesn't really know what to do with those, right? There's a tie. So to overcome that, a really good MG will follow up an extension by providing more analysis as to why your argument is superior. And now we'll talk about some don'ts. First thing is you don't want to forget to make extensions. This happens a lot when the other team has conceded your case or an advantage. Your instinct might be to kind of ignore that, right? It's conceded. It's already happening in the debate, right? But by not talking about it at all, or by not making any extensions, a lot of times you're letting your opponents control where the debate is, and that's on their offense, and that's where their arguments are. So you want to make sure you're emphasizing your arguments as well by making extensions off of the case. So you keep control of the debate, and you keep control of why your arguments are important, not just focusing on their arguments as well. You also don't want to extend every single argument, especially if the team has conceded an advantage. You want to find that balance between not talking about it at all and not extending everything and spending way too much time for an argument that everyone is, basically decided is, an argument that you're winning in the round via conceding it. So instead, what you can do is extend the thesis of an advantage. After all, your judge is going to be more persuaded by an advantage that they understand really well and by arguments that they have a really clear understanding of. So it never hurts to just really quickly extend the thesis of your argument, and you can highlight certain aspects which are particularly important. So that way the judge is totally on the same page as you, and you've successfully extended it in an efficient way that doesn't suck up a ton of time by having to extend every little thing. Don't be afraid also to internally collapse within the advantage. Maybe you don't need it to extend every single uniqueness point. You just need the first one or the first A point under it or whatever. Make sense so far? So good? We're on the same page? All right. Cool. So then you also don't want to extend sections of arguments in a really vague way. I can't count the number of times debaters have said, extend my uniqueness, and then move on and just leave it at that. That might be okay. Some of this is judge preference in terms of where they draw the line of what's doing enough work for an argument, but I've always found that just saying extend my uniqueness isn't really helpful. It's not specific enough to really get you anything, and it doesn't really tell the judge what you want them to do with that argument or how that's going to help you overcome the opponent's argument. So I think it's much more helpful and effective to extend either a particular argument or, these are my particular uniqueness arguments, this is what it does for me. Extend that claim or tagline and then follow it up by explaining what it does. Make sense? blank stares. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Feel free to shout out questions at any time. All right. So next we're still rebuilding the case here. Now we're going to move on to talking about how you might be weighing or framing impacts in the MG. So if you've got arguments in the case that prioritize your impacts, PMCs take note. Sometimes it's really helpful to build in some of that impact prioritization right out of the gate. But as the MG, you want to make sure you're extending that and pointing out why that's important. You got to find a balance between yourself and the PMR. You don't want to do too much of their job because you want to be making arguments elsewhere in the debate. But if you have those arguments, you should be extending them and pointing out why your impacts are the most important. Keep that in the judge's mind throughout the entirety of the debate, and it's never too early to start doing impact calculus. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of that if that comes up. As for clarifying or summarizing advantages, if on the off chance your partner, the Prime Minister, if they forget to finish an advantage, maybe they ran out of time and didn't get to terminalize your impact all the way, but you need that argument to win the debate, or if things have come out a little unclear, feel free to take some time, if in that instance, to clarify the advantages, fill in some holes that maybe got missed, because ultimately, using your case as a tool to win the debate is going to be most helpful, as opposed to just, my partner spent 3.5 minutes reading this, but we'll just pretend it didn't exist anymore, right? Using your case is important, so you got to make sure you've got all the tools there. Lastly, we'll talk about how you might be comparing the case to the counterplan. It's often useful, especially to point out things like solvency deficits to the counterplan as you're talking about the case. I'm amazed at how many times case counterplan debates, there's very little discussion about the solvency mechanisms and how the counterplan is actually capturing the advantages of case. A lot of times the neg team just assumes they do. They never point it out exactly how they capture the advantages, and a lot of times the AF team just assumes, I guess they do a little bit, but never point out specific reasons why they don't. So when you're on the case debate, and maybe you prefer to do this on the counterplan, but I think it's helpful as you're going through the case anyways. When you're on the link level, point out those links that the counterplan doesn't capture. Point out those solvency mechanisms that the counterplan doesn't capture. So that way, it's a lot easier to discuss those comparisons. And again, you're controlling that debate because you're framing it as in your 1AC, which has the biggest impacts in the round. Okay. So, as I pointed out, one of the biggest mistakes an MG can make is not effectively using their case. So, what are some tips to be able to do that a little better? First, incorporate case-based offense into your blocks. That means you should know your plan text in and out, or at the very least during prep you should have a general idea of it, as well as your advantages, and maybe even some add-on advantages before you prep, right? So when preparation starts, before the round, topic comes out, you and your coach are huddling, figuring out the strategy. You should be able to figure out what your plan is going to be. And so as your PM is writing the case, you should be on the same page as them. So that way, as you're writing your blocks, you are able to take that into account and say, oh, this is a really great offensive argument based on my second advantage, or our solvency mechanism works better here than this potential counterplan. I should point out why that would be beneficial for us. Additionally, this is kind of similar, but you need to be effectively communicating with the Prime Minister in prep along those same lines. You're a Prime Minister, and for those of you who might be PMing a little bit, your PM should notify you of key arguments or hidden preempts as they're writing the case. And if you think there's a predictable argument that you might struggle with or that you think is pretty strong, you should also be communicating with them for arguments that you need to put in the case. So there should be communication back and forth between the two of you. So you're on the same page and you already have some weapons in your 1AC arsenal to be able to deploy. Also, you should have a really good understanding of the case. It's just as important for the MG to understand the case as it is for the Prime Minister. What my partner and I always used to do, which I found was really helpful, is the walk between your prep room and where your round is. Go over the case. Have a quick discussion where you can say, I would always just say, can you just summarize the advantage for me? Give me the thesis of the advantages so I know exactly what we're working with. Because sometimes if you don't have that discussion, the first time you're really hearing your case is during the round, and that's then you're kind of behind. So make sure you understand the case, utilize the walk to the room to be able to capitalize on that. You should also be flowing your case. This is kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes people don't have the best flow of their case. MG and tell the LO. No. You want to be effectively utilizing those arguments, which means you need to have a good record of what those arguments are. You're probably going to be able to much more effectively extend and utilize those arguments if you have them written in front of you, as opposed to just having them in the back of your mind. All right. So now we're going to shift. Actually, does anyone have any questions about utilizing the case at all? No? Yeah.
So, I don't know if you're gonna talk about this later on, but like incorporating a criterion into like your arguments as the MG, like are you supposed to bring it up in your speech, like this is why this is important?
So, as far as a criterion, a lot of times in the 1AC there'll be sort of a framework that's laid out very early on, and 90% of the time it's going to be net benefits, because for most of the time, at least in all the tournaments that I've been to, it's policy-focused topics. That's not true of all tournaments, and that's not true of all regions. So most of the time, that criterion is going to be net benefits, which it kind of incorporates all, or at least most impacts, depending on how you want to debate it. So you should be demonstrating through weighing your impacts why the case is most net beneficial. So that is the way you would, the criterion is already there for you in the 1AC, you just have to explain why you're most net beneficial.
Okay.
Other questions? No? All right. So, off-case arguments. 90% of the time, the LO is going to read off-case arguments. You might have that once or twice where the other team just blows up your case with all sorts of arguments, but that doesn't happen very often. Off-case arguments are very strategic because that allows the other team to provide those reasons why plan isn't net beneficial to potentially outweigh the other team in the form of disadvantages. Obviously, there's other strategic off-case arguments as well. So what's the difference between on-case and off-case arguments? What's an on-case argument? It's pretty intuitive.
And on-case arguments and arguments that comes out of the PMC. It's the AF's case, essentially.
So the AF case, yeah, that's the case. So any argument that takes place on that case, whether that's an LO response or an MG response to that response, those are arguments that are all taking place on the case. On case. Yes, we're all clear on that. So then, what is an off-case argument?
Anything that does not directly relate to the original PMC.
Not necessarily that
Well,
doesn't relate, because it'll relate, but you're on the right track. The off-case arguments are those that are independent from the case, and they take the forms of disads, counterplans, critiques, procedural issues like topicality, those types of arguments. Positions that are happening not on the case. We clear? And so those all, for those newer folks, those will actually all take place on their own sheets of paper. So a lot of times, when you're giving your roadmap, when you stand up at the beginning of your speech, the judge will say, how many off, and you'll say, I've got 3 off-case positions, and then we'll talk on case. Those off-case positions are your disads, your counterplans, or whatever. They'll all be on their own sheets of paper that help you, keep you organized, keep everyone literally on the same page throughout the debate. So there are some things you should remember as you answer your off-case positions. So first, you want to order your arguments strategically. So when you set out to answer the positions, you'll start out by creating that roadmap that we just discussed for the debate. And you should think about this in terms of how the judge is going to weigh these arguments, how the arguments are going to be prioritized. So first off, you should probably deal with issues that are a priori, or they come first before anything else in the debate. So things like theory and procedurals. Because if you have, say a topicality debate, the other team says, oh, you're not topical, they read their shell, in their shell somewhere, they're going to say, Judge, you need to look at this argument first. It's a priori, and think of it like a race, right? If the other team cheated by being not topical, or decreased education and fairness somehow by reading an untopical plan, then the negative team didn't have a fair shot in the debate to begin with, so their arguments aren't going to be worth as much and are going to be discounted. So therefore, that's where the debate should be, is on topicality. It's the burden of the affirmative to prove they're topical before the judge can even look at anything else. So you wanna, if there's a topicality or a priori argument in the debate, you wanna be able to address that first, because otherwise you could lose the debate there, nothing else would really matter. Again, talking about the case, some people like to put case on bottom, but you just gotta be really careful about your time allocation to make sure that you don't forget to get to it. So wherever you put it, make sure you have time to get to it. Then disads, counterplans, critiques, depending on the framing and weighting of impacts of the critique, that might be something to talk about before disads, but the non-a priori arguments kind of can be shuffled in your own preference and your own order. And you should experiment with how you like to structure your MG, how you like your flow, your arguments. I know for me, putting my case earlier in my order was helpful for utilizing those arguments later on. But for some people, they prefer to get out all their offense, get out everything else, and then re-clarify when they do get to case. So play with it, see what works best for you. The next thing is you want to diversify your arguments. You should have different types of responses to each off-case position. If they read a disad and you only have, a couple non-uniques, then it makes it a lot easier for the MO to stand up and say, well, extend our uniqueness, let me explain why it's preferable to these arguments, and then the rest of it's conceded. So as long as we beat those arguments, then we're all set. We got this in the bag. So you want to make sure you have different types of arguments, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. You also want to allocate your time wisely. As the MG, there's a lot coming at you a lot of times, so having proper time allocation and making sure you have time to get to everything is really crucial. You can kind of base your timing on the time spent your opponents to make arguments. So for example, if it took them only 30 seconds to spit out this really quick procedural, then you don't want to spend a minute and a half answering it, right? Because that's not a good time trade-off. You want to, for theory arguments, try to stay within 15 seconds. For other arguments, it can kind of depend a little bit depending on where you want to focus your time, but try to not get shorted in terms of the time allocation, so you can base it loosely off of how much time it took your opponents. Okay, offense. What is an offensive argument? And if you learn nothing else from this lecture, we're going to learn that offense is really important in the MG. Even if you don't quite grasp what offense is, it's very important, and you'll get there, and then you'll be able to make offensive arguments. So what is an offensive argument? A turn. An offensive argument does take the form of a turn. So it's a reason why you win. It is a reason why you win, right? Rather than a defensive argument which mitigates or says the other team's argument isn't true, it mitigates the truth claim there. An offensive argument says the opposite. So a link might say, oh, your plan does something that causes the economy to collapse, whereas your link turn says, no, the economy isn't doing very well, we actually save it, right? So neg says, plan collapses the economy, you say, no, we do something that saves it. It's the opposite, and by saying you save it, you have an impact attached here, right? An offensive argument just demonstrates why you win by having an impact attached to it. So yes, these are usually labeled as turns. If you have trouble coming up with an offense, there's a couple things you can do. First is think creatively, right? Think about all the things your plan could possibly do in terms of being able to resolve the issue that the link the disadvantage link is having with your plan. Try to be creative. Also, using your case. I know I've been harping on this a lot, but it's a really good way to generate offense. A lot of people try to just generate parallel turns, which aren't exactly stemming from the advantages of your case. So make sure you're using your case. How do your advantages demonstrate why that link might not be true and why you're actually able to capture that scenario? Also, use your partner. And your partner, just going back a little bit, should also be helping you allocate your time wisely. Keep an eye on your partner if you're a PM, and that's a good rule of thumb is ask your partner to help keep you on track. But similarly, your partner should also can help you generate offense if you're struggling. I know there's plenty of times where I would say to my partner, listen, can you give me one or two arguments? I'm not sure I have quite enough coverage here in a particular area. So you're a team. Use your teammates to help you out. So offense, really important. You can also use points of information. So if the other team is going too fast and you're a little overwhelmed, or you're just barely hanging in there, your instinct is probably just gonna be to put your head down and just try your best to keep up, right? But what's really gonna help you is if you nod, or you give your partner a little nudge and say, hey, can you ask a question? I need some time. I need some pen time to write my own arguments. So feel free to have your partner ask a question to buy you time, because that's gonna help you out the most. And it doesn't even have to be a good question sometimes. It's just for the purpose of you being able to generate those offensive arguments and be able to have a little time to come up with those things and apply your case in ways that are helpful. Similarly, if you don't fully understand a position, do ask for the thesis of the position. I tell this to a lot of my newer debaters, particularly when they hear new Ks or critiques they don't understand. Just give me the thesis of your argument. Ask your opponents for that. And not even just for critiques, for disads as well. They can be complicated and confusing, particularly when they come out fast. So there's no shame in just saying, give me the thesis of your argument, please. It'll, yes, they will be able to re-explain the argument to the judge, but if it helps you generate offense against it, then you're in a much better position than you would be otherwise. So don't be afraid to put your hand up, ask a question, get the clarification you need to be able to deliver a successful MG. Alright, you can also use prep. This isn't something that's done a ton, but it's not unheard of, and I've seen very successful debaters use prep in the round itself. So the LO comes out, maybe you're caught off guard by an argument, or maybe you're just a little overwhelmed. There's no shame in taking 30 seconds, a minute of your speech time, because it's your speech time. You can do whatever you want with it, and prep out some good arguments for yourself. Sometimes this is a lot more helpful than stumbling through 30 seconds of sort of coherent arguments, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to take the first 30 seconds of my speech, I'm going to come up with some really baller arguments, and then you're going to kill it in your speech. So don't be afraid to do that. You want to be careful. You don't want to be spending like half your speech prepping, because then it might not be as effective. You might not be able to cover everything, but feel free to use that. You do want to let the judge know that you're starting your timer though, because otherwise it's very uncomfortable and awkward for everyone. They don't know what's going on. So just be like, all right, I'm starting my speech now. And then you can go. And then just stand up and deliver when you're ready. Okay. Questions about answering off-case arguments in terms of these tips and pointers? Really? Yeah.
What's the practice in terms of adding another advantage? Maybe you have time for some kind of an add-on. Is that common or? Yeah.
I haven't seen that done a lot, but it is very strategic. So it's.
Yeah.
I've seen it done a couple times, and it's something that is frankly encouraged, particularly if your opponents run a counter plan that maybe captures the advantages you have, but it doesn't capture this other sweet thing that your plan does. So don't be afraid to, don't be afraid to do an add-on advantage. That's something definitely to be encouraged, but isn't done enough entirely. But yeah, okay, yeah.
You talked about, you mentioned parallel turns. Would you elaborate on that a little more?
So I'm not an expert on the terminology, but my understanding is that okay. So if you have a disad that's, so here's the uniqueness of okay, but this isn't a good example. Honestly, I don't know the exact definition. I'll look it up. I'll tell you. Arlo Kuzwad, do you know? Or do
Well,
Alexander?
my guess would be that if you're debating against an econ disad and you say your case is to improve like environmental regulations, and you've got all these advantages about improving the environment, but you also have arguments that those regulations would help the economy. That seems like a good sort of parallel turn, but I could also see one that's not so good, that isn't quite connected to your advantages in the way that you would solve it.
Right, so just to clarify, so I think, the links are going to be, here's link 1, link 2, right? So maybe your links aren't necessarily turning this, like maybe the plan collapses the economy in this particular way, right? But it does solve back for this impact. So I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right here. The parallel turn is that it solves back for this impact. So you're not exactly link turning, because you're not link turning the specific examples here, but your plan does do something that solves back for this impact. So you're still getting offense because you're still solving back for this impact, but you aren't directly necessarily refuting these links. And that's kind of dangerous, because if they win these links, that these ones do lead to a collapse. So if you're ignoring these, then that's no good. But if you can provide defensive arguments for why maybe you don't necessarily link, but you are able to solve back for economic collapse in another way, that would be a parallel turn, as opposed to the straight turns, which is this one, and then you say the opposite, that's the straight turn. Okay.
Like if they say regulations hurt the economy, and your turn as helping the environment generally helps the economy, you've sort of turned their link, but you haven't answered their
Exactly,
link.
it turns the link without
They still
directly
win
answering it.
regulations hurt the economy.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, we eventually got there, good. Okay. What time does this lecture end? 2:30. 2:30? Okay, so for the rest of the time, if no one else has any other questions, and feel free to jump in, let's go through some specific positions and talk about the arguments you can make against them. And you'll probably hear this specific to other positions throughout the week, but hey, MGs have to answer off-case positions. It's very important. So let's start with disads. What are types of arguments you can make against a disad? Non-unique. What is a non-unique argument?
Means your plan doesn't cause anything that's already happening in the status quo.
So it's not what their description of what's happening in the status quo. It's going to be based on your description of what's happening in the status quo. So if their argument, again, if the uniqueness says that the economy is okay, and this is just the simple summary, right? There's going to be that level of fragility there, that things aren't maybe necessarily the best ever, but they're all right. The impact's not happening. And then you've got the link that a plan causes econ collapse somehow, doesn't matter, and then the impact that econ collapse is bad. So what does the non-unique argument look like to answer this disad? So we already decided that it's the opposite of their description of the status quo, right? So it's pretty intuitive, right? So there's the uniqueness argument that says one thing, and then there's the non-unique, so it's not that. So it says the economy is really bad. And it's really important to control the uniqueness debate, because the uniqueness controls the direction of the link. What does that mean? Anyone? Yes?
So it means that if the uniqueness is going one way, and then if the link is like, okay, so that was a bad start. So like in this scenario, if you're saying the economy is doing very well, and then you have link turns to say you make the economy better, you don't get any offense off of that. It's like it's actually like the plan does something to change. Like,
Okay,
to
so
actually
let's talk about link turns, and then for those of you who maybe that didn't make the most sense.
No, that didn't make very much sense.
No, that was excellent, but it will make more sense now that we talk about link turns, yes? So, as we discussed, turn is an offensive argument. Label your turns, by the way, especially in the MG. It just makes your argument sound more badass, because it is a badass argument, so let everyone know that's a turn. Watch out, we're coming at you with impacts, right? So, we got a link turn. So what does the link turn look like to answer this link?
Plan boosts the economy.
So the plan actually helps the economy. Sorry, my abbreviations are weird, but hopefully you get the idea. So for the argument that uniqueness controls the direction of the link, here we've got that the economy's okay, it's doing pretty well. And if it's doing pretty well, then there's much less offense that the plan saves the economy, right? Because it's already okay, right? But whereas if you went, no, the economy's not doing well at all, we need our plan to be able to save it, then all of a sudden you have all this offense, you're saving the economy, right? You're Superman or lady, so it's awesome. So we got non-uniques, we got link turns. These arguments pair really well together and should be paired together, because again, if you don't have uniqueness, then if the economy's okay, it's still doing okay, you haven't really created that net benefit, which, as we discussed, is kind of the name of the game most of the time, creating that net benefit. Okay, what other arguments can we make on the disad? Sorry.
Impact turns.
Impact turns. Oh, bold. Okay, what's an impact turn? I'll give you a hint. It's really similar to the relationship between the link and the link turn.
Econ collapse is good.
Yeah, so it's the opposite of the impact. So it says econ collapse. Good. So you can list it. So even if, most of this stuff is true, doesn't matter. It's a good thing that we class the economy, because the economy is real terrible, and we'll give you a bunch of reasons why. These are sometimes a little trickier. A lot of times this will be more intuitive to come up with, because a lot of this is predicated on your case, and this might be something that comes out of the fly because you don't always know what their impact scenario is going to be. But at the same time, if you're ready with a set of impact turns, you might catch an MO off guard being like, whoa, I wasn't expecting these impact turns, and I know our uniqueness and link story super well because I did all this research, but I don't know, I just kind of have this random block memorized. I don't know much more about my impact than that, so impact turns can be pretty strategic. Yeah.
Okay, so for an impact turn, so even if in our prior speech we said the economy, like our plan increases the economy, but since we collapse the economy, it's good. Or if you buy into their argument, if
So
this would be good.
I think what you're getting at is something that is very important to remember. We do not want to both link turn and impact turn, because as you're pointing out, what that says is the economy is bad right now, and we save it, hooray, we're amazing, but that collapsing the economy is good, so shoot, right? So you want to pick a strategy as an MG. So when I say diversifying your arguments, that's definitely good, but you also want to be very careful so that you aren't internally contradicting yourself, because then all of a sudden you shot yourself in the foot.
You also want to be careful if in your PMC one of your advantages goes out to econ collapse, and then in the MG you read impact turns saying the econ collapse is good.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You want
careful about
your
that.
offense to be consistent with your case, because then all of a sudden, oh no, we wasted our advantage. Yes.
Do you have any advice on prioritizing link turns versus impact turns? Because I know Kyle's kind of told us to prefer link turns, but it seems like it could also be subjective depending on what comes out of
I think
the
a
other.
couple things. First, personal preference. What you're comfortable with is probably you're going to do the best with, and a lot of times this is the most intuitive, because a lot of times this is, and especially the link turns and probably the non-unique is going to be stemming directly from your case, so you're going to be most comfortable with that. And like I said before, the impact turns, a lot of times you don't know what their impact scenarios are going to be, because they might just read some random politics disad with this, impact scenario you had no idea you were going to hear, so maybe you aren't quite as prepared to deal with those impacts and turn those impacts. However, like I said before, it can be very strategic to catch the MO off guard. Third thing maybe second, I don't remember, to consider is the strength of arguments in the shell. So if, maybe, you can look to see where the strengths are and which areas might be more susceptible to attack, right? Like if their impacts are pretty weak, they have one scenario, they don't really terminalize it very well, then you can very quickly overcome that with the impact turns, right? And get rid of that argument, and all of a sudden it's offensive for you. At the same time, if the impact isn't very good, then maybe the risk of, maybe it makes more sense to do this strategy, and then all of a sudden be like, yeah, our case is so incredibly badass it overcomes the impact, whoa. So I think first and foremost, personal comfort. You kind of have to make a decision pretty quick. The other reason why this is more common is because this part comes out first, right? So you're writing arguments as they're shelling the disad, as opposed to, you can't really start writing these impacts until you hear what the impact is. And so, while sometimes you can predict what it is, sometimes you can't. And so you just have more time to write responses when you're doing this structure. Yes?
I'd also consider what you think the MO is going to collapse to, because if they have, say, two disadvantages, one is very topic specific and very well warranted, and the other one's kind of iffy, like you think that they're just going to collapse out of it in order to save time. It may be strategic to put impact turns on that to force them to go a way that they may not be comfortable with.
That's another good thing to consider. What else? We've only got 3 things up here. There's a lot more ways we can answer this other than that.
No link.
No link, yeah. So is a no link an offensive or defensive argument? It is defensive, right? Because it is mitigating the link. It is saying that link is not true. As opposed to the link term, which says the opposite. Whereas the plan causes econ collapse, we cause it to do better. So a no link, it's hard to do without the specific links here, but you'd say it doesn't cause economic collapse for whatever reasons they're demonstrating. Other things.
So, with the no link, back on that, so let's just say so if somebody goes up and they just read that the economy is gonna collapse, would a link be because they don't have something specific to the plan text, and that's why there's not a link? Or
Sometimes if a team is just reading whatever their coach gave them or something that doesn't necessarily apply, maybe they'll read a link that just doesn't link. Other times they'll read links that maybe kind of link, but you can make arguments as to why your case doesn't have the impact on further actions, which might actually be an internal, a no internal link argument, that it just won't create that effect, right? Like their link might be, oh, when plan passes, all these senators decide to vote for this other thing. You make the argument, no they won't. Here's some reasons why they would never switch. They're, very staunch on this issue, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we got no links. I kind of mentioned no internal links, which are the same thing except for this fun stuff that happens in here, getting from plan does this thing to how it does collapse the economy. What else are we missing?
Uniqueness overwhelms the link.
Uniqueness overwhelms the link. What does that mean? Sorry, what's that?
It's kind of like an inevitability claim.
Insofar as, I don't think that's the best description of it. Uniqueness overwhelms is basically saying, if they don't say the economy's okay, they say the economy is super, everyone has all the right cash money, it's great, everyone has jobs, we're employed, we're innovating, we're working, things are great, then unless plan is something ridiculously radical, it's probably not going to cause that much of a difference, right? So that's why uniqueness as the neg has to have this sort of it has to have a brink, right? It has to have things are okay, but there's this one thing that could happen that the plan does that makes everything basically go to hell, or that we're on the brink right now. Things could get much worse very quickly. So uniqueness overwhelms is just, if everything's so great, we probably can't mess it up. Plan's probably not going to do that much. So we talked about how non-uniques and link terms go together, right? What does uniqueness overwhelms the link need to go with? So we already talked about it. It needs to go with link defense or no link arguments, right? Because you're saying that everything is super great, so plan can't mess anything up. But they have links. They'll probably have 2 or 3 reasons why they think plan will mess it up. And so you need to have defensive arguments that say, no. And you can add more on the uniqueness level here to demonstrate that, but you need to at least answer their arguments that indicate those specific reasons why things might get messed up. Question, or I guess there's one more. That's very important.
No impact.
No impacts. sense on the impact level. Similarly, how you said, they say plan causes it, you say no it doesn't. They say plan collapses the economy and that's bad, you say no it's not, or no we don't do that. Similarly, you can couple the no internal link arguments. These will kind of all be in this section together. Arguments that just mitigate mitigate the magnitude and the likelihood of the impact itself. Make sense? Questions about answering disads as the MG? Yeah, go.
Oh, and I just was wondering if you have advice for like prepping and stuff, like prepping like link turns kind of like out of the blue during prep time, if you will, like just like preparing offense as the MG, maybe like theory responses and everything.
So what I did in prep as the MG is before the tournament, I had a template. Because my senior year, I was part of a very, very small team. It was just my partner and I. And so, yes. So I had a template where when I read the news, I would try to kind of categorize arguments into this template where it's literally just like U.S. econ, bad, U.S. China relations, good, and then I'd have the same thing for their bad, right? And I'd fill in arguments as I could, right? I had this for a whole bunch of different sections. And why this was useful for me is during prep, I would be able to utilize the uniqueness arguments, right? So I just got to transcribe, it's like, oh, our case is doing something with the financial sector or doing something that might hurt businesses economically and freak them out a little bit. Okay, I'm probably going to need some econ arguments based on that. So okay, I got in prep, I'm going to write down my uniqueness arguments that I've already got prepared. And then this is where knowing your case is really helpful. If you know your advantages and you can predict the arguments that are going to be run against you, then all of a sudden you can start utilizing those advantages. Well, they're probably going to say this is going to freak out businesses, but our advantage says, it's going to be able to solve the economy in this other way, or it's not going to freak out businesses. So using your case for preparing offense is really helpful for that. So the main thing is just being able to predict the arguments that are going to be read against you, and then being able to adapt. And sometimes, having a coach help you with those arguments or working with your partner to come up with more of those arguments can be helpful. But in terms of prep, I think my process was I always had a stack of paper in front of me, and as soon as the timer went off, I would start prepping basic templates, templated responses. So I'd start with T, and then I'd write out this little shell that would say, here I'm going to put my disads interpretation, here are going to be my counter framework, right? And so for me, I'd have very, very small abbreviations, so that way in the round I could just fill it in, literally. So play around with what works for you. And so I do that while my partner and coach would come up with the plan, and then by the time I was done with some of that preliminary stuff or writing down the uniqueness arguments that I already have and filling in that top level of the debate, then I can utilize the plan and the advantages to generate more offense. So that was kind of my method, but play around, figure out what works for you. A lot of times you'll need to do a little bit on the fly research during prep to come up with those offensive arguments, but using your case is usually the most efficient way to generate offense, and you're going to know it the best. Other questions?
Would that be another argument to put against the disad would be, the disad links to the counterplan more, depending on, what else is in the round.
Absolutely, yeah, and for the disad, if there's a disad counterplan debate, you can either make this argument on the counterplan or on the disad. Sometimes teams will read strategies that just don't make sense, or they'll read a strategy that contradicts itself knowing that they won't go for a position that they'll kick out. But you don't want to let a team get away with having a disad that links just as hard, if not harder, to their counterplan than your plan. So on the disad, feel free to indicate where or what it is about the disad that links to the counterplan. So somewhere in the debate, do that if that occurs. Okay, are we all good here? Can I erase this? I guess I don't have to. Okay, so counterplan. So we've got a text of the counterplan, right? We've got the competition can't be combined with the plan, or it shouldn't be able to either functionally, you just, in the real world, you can't do those two things at the same time, or through net benefits. The case links to the disad, but the counter plan does not, so therefore it is net beneficial to do the counter plan, which also captures the advantages of the case. And then there's the solvency. What types of arguments can you make against a counter plan? Perm. What is a perm?
All of your
Usually
plan
people,
and all of your,
Yeah, say it louder.
all of your plan and all most of the counter plan.
Yes, exactly. Your perm includes all of your case, the entire thing. If it didn't include the entire thing, that would be severing, and that's probably not the best, because then you could just like jump from case, like, oh, we do this, then we do this now, avoid your offense, little slippery links. So all of your plan and all or parts of the counter plan. Usually it's all the counter plan. I've only seen part of the counter plan a couple times. So it just says, hey, we can do both of these things at the same time. All the benefits of our thing, all the benefits of your thing, we're all good. Okay, so perm. What else?
Solvency deficits.
Solvency deficits. Seriously, make these arguments, they might seem obvious. If the counterplan just doesn't capture one of your advantages, point it out, please. A lot of times, everyone's just kind of making assumptions about what the counterplan captures and doesn't capture. Say they don't capture this one argument, and then what are you going to do with that advantage the counterplan doesn't capture? You're going to really just weigh into that and just like, this is the most important thing. Definitely outweighs their disad. So, solvency deficit is very important, because the counterplan won't always necessarily capture both of your advantages. And you should be writing a case where it's not susceptible to being counterplanned very well. That's something your PMC should take into account when they're figuring out the advantages in the plan text. So make sure you indicate that the counterplan might not capture one or both of the advantages. Okay, other arguments?
it's non-competitive.
So demonstrating why it's non-competitive usually takes the form of a perm. So it's not competitive, it doesn't compete with the plan. So how about just general solvency arguments, right? They use an actor that doesn't have the resources to be able to do the plan. We'll point that out. Make normal solvency arguments like you would against a case.
Probably a number of theory arguments to make.
Sorry, what's that?
Theory arguments to make against a counterplan, depending on, what the counterplan is. Maybe it's fee out of use, or multiple agents, or steal some of your.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You should make theory arguments. Maybe, that's also a personal comfort in your strategy based on what you and your partner like to go for. But if that's something your PMR might want to go for, absolutely. Theory is a pain in the butt for the MO to have to answer. Because it's an a priori argument, so they have to answer it, and they might, end up spending a lot more time on it than you did. So theory can be strategic. And again, for those of you who are new, that's sort of those arguments that are a debate about the debate, what should be allowed for issues of fairness in education.
And some counterplans are calling for those theory arguments because they're just, if all the individuals are suddenly going to believe in anarchy.
Right, exactly. Like if every actor is going to be doing something at the same time, that's probably not fair. One time my partner and I read an immigration counter plan that said, let people in except for child molesters. That's probably doesn't allow a lot of ground for the other team. Things like that. When you're feeling like we don't know how to answer this counter plan. If you're ever in a position where you're just like, shit, I don't understand. I don't know what to do here. Maybe theory is your best bet, regardless. Okay, perm, solvency deficits, solvency theory. We're missing the biggie. What did we talk about was the most important thing in the MG?
Offense.
Offense, right? Do not be afraid to read a disad. You can read a series of turns on the counterplan, or just be like, oh, what, everyone? New piece of paper. All right, we're reading a new disad on this thing. So counterplan, or just make sure you have some offense, why the counterplan is just a bad idea. You will be amazed at how many counterplans are just bad ideas. So take advantage of that. Read it as that. Yeah.
Does the perm act as offense?
The perm is not necessarily a reason why you win the debate, but it is a reason why the counterplan would go away if it's not competitive, which then makes it substantially easier for you to win the debate. How are we doing on time?
We're out of time.
We're out of time? Alright, well, if you have any more questions about the MG, feel free to come find me later. I'm happy to talk to y'all about all the debate things, because it's my job, and I like it.